loved it. Highly recommend. I'll tell you more. Good evening, everyone. Good to see everyone out this evening. Glad you joined us as we continue in our study of Romans. I'm going to hop ahead a little bit here. I think this is in the ballpark of where we ended up last time, about Romans 1, 16 and 17 thereabouts. Let's take a moment to recap what we talked about last week before we dive back into it. So we did indeed get into chapter 1. We talked about Paul's identification of himself as a servant in chapter 1 and in verse 1. And we said that that word's probably better translated slave. And that master-slave relationship really helps us to understand God's grace because He's a loving master who owes us nothing, but He gives us everything. And that's just a beautiful picture of His grace, giving us eternal life through Jesus Christ, though He owes us nothing. And He's going to come back to the idea of being a slave in chapter 6, telling us that we're slaves to something. So keep that in mind. We talked about the obedience of faith, verse 5. I'm going to hold off on that for now because I will come back to it, or at least I plan to come back to it in a little bit tonight. But the obedience of faith, I want to keep that front and center. We talked about Paul's obligation to preach the gospel in verses 14 and 15. And he had a debt to do that. He'd received the gospel from the Lord to deliver to others. And he said he was eager to discharge that debt. And we talked about how we have that same obligation, and it's not an optional thing for us to do, despite how Christians sometimes treat taking the gospel to others. It's not an optional thing. We've all got that debt, and we should all be eager as Paul was, as he says in verses 14 and 15. And then verses 16 and 17 here, the thesis statement of Romans, we talked about how that gospel was called out in Isaiah, specifically chapters 52 and 53, but that was not really going to be anything new to Paul's Jewish audience, specifically in the church at Rome there. We talked about the gospel being the great leveler. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, male or free, female, slave or free, whatever. We all have the same problem of sin, and we all need the same solution in Jesus Christ for that problem. And we talked about the gospel revealing God's righteousness, as it says there in verse 17, and how we ought to want to know about those good aspects of His character, like His righteousness. We don't want to be like those who ignore God and don't try to seek Him out. And we're going to read a good bit more about them here in the next few verses in the latter part of chapter 1. But instead, we want to be like those who seek to know about God and understand His character and try to make the things He loves the things that we love, and try to avoid the things that it is that He detests. Because we're trusting Him to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. It's really that working definition of faith that we've been emphasizing this quarter. And that should just about bring us up to where we left off. But going back to that obedience of faith, that purpose statement of Romans in chapter 1 and verse 5, to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of His name among all the nations. That's not up here. But with that in mind, if somebody wanted to use verse 16 right here, and support a faith alone argument, faith alone can save, how might they do that? You see how they could read verse 16 here. Maybe there's my pointer, it's not super bright, but the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. You see how people could try to take that and make it say something it's not saying? Just say, well, the faith alone, right? That's what it says right there. We might, the church or members of it over the years, might have allowed a false dichotomy to exist. We might have, think about, not really a spectrum, but two different places where you could be mentally, I guess. And on one hand over here, you've got belief. And that's just nothing more than believing that something is true, and people who think belief alone, and there's just no, obedience is not necessary at all. And this other side, this other point where you can be, is belief, right? It's obedience, and I said belief, sorry, it's obedience. And you have people who think, I can obey my way into heaven. I can work my way into heaven. And we let these paradigms arise sometimes where we think falsely that it's kind of all of one or the other, and we have to choose one or the other. And I'm not so sure that that goes along with what Scripture teaches. Remember from the overview, we know the way that a letter's writer uses a word contextually helps us understand what that word means in a letter. Yes, sir, Patrick.
I read one author who said, faith is a verb masquerading as a noun.
Faith is a verb masquerading as a noun.
Look at it that way. It's powerful, I think.
We're going to talk about verbs and nouns here in a little bit. And I really like that definition because, that's going to come into play in just a little bit. Thank you very much. Faith is a verb masquerading as a noun. I like that. But from the overview, we talked about the way that a letter's writer using a word contextually, that dictates the meaning of the word in the letters. And in Paul, that word believe includes or at least implies the existence of some level of obedience. Again, we've talked about trusting in God, that He's going to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. We've already seen that this letter is about the obedience of faith, right? That's what chapter 1 and verse 5 says. It's about the obedience of faith. And actually, when we get ahead in chapter 4, we'll jump ahead there in a little bit, but the first few verses of that, when Paul talks about Abraham and his faith in God, it's really telling there how some of these things work. James' use of belief, and by the way, that word belief and the word faith, they are the same word in the root language, in the Greek language. They are the same. So James' use of that word is just acknowledging who Jesus is. What does James 2:19 say? The devils believe and tremble. Right? So they acknowledge who Jesus is. They believe. Is that going to save them? They believe and tremble, right? It's not going to save them at all. It's just acknowledging who He is. But if I really trust God and I'm confident that He's going to do for me what I can't do for myself, wouldn't I really want to do whatever it is that He asks of me? Whatever I can for Him? When we think about the Pauline sense of the word, obedience isn't doing something to merit our salvation. It's not working so that I can earn my salvation or work my way into heaven. It's really more in the natural response to God for what it is that He's done for me. Because of what He's done for me, I want to do everything I can for Him. Remember verse 1? Paul identifying as a slave to that good master. Because that master is so good and gives me everything, I want to do everything that I can for him. Yes, Lisa.
Wouldn't by our obedience be showing our love for God?
I think so, absolutely, it does, right? But it's not a type of working to try to earn our salvation. It is exactly, it's a result. It's because God has done so much for me that I love Him, right? I want to do everything I can to be pleasing to Him, right? And that's that obedience of faith. It's not an obedience of works, right? Which would be, I'm just going to try to do all the works I can to work my way into heaven. It's two different things. Yes, sir?
Denominationalism calls baptism works, but yet the New Testament tells us it's the answer of a good conscience towards God.
Yeah, exactly.
So and that's another reason why I hate James, because that's the only place in the New Testament you're going to find the words faith only together, but it says not by faith only.
Exactly. Thank you. Very good thoughts. So, so just to try to pull that together, we can't go on the faith only side and say that that's absolutely it. But we shouldn't live on the obedience-only side either. We shouldn't be, and Paul's writing to, especially when he talks to the Jews and about adherence to law and things like that, that's really kind of obedience only. They're over here in that side. They're like, we can follow the law so well we could work our way into heaven. Okay, that's where they are and kind of part of the challenge that he's dealing with. Let's jump ahead to Romans chapter 4. It's not going to be on the screen, but if you'll open your Bibles there, Romans chapter 4, starting with verse 4. Somebody read that nice and loud for us.
Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt. How far do you want me to read?
Verse 5 as well.
Okay. But to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness.
Did you catch what verse 5 says? To the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. That says flat out that it's faith that's going to make us righteous. Trusting God to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. Doing every work we could possibly do is not going to accomplish making us righteous before God. People will say sometimes, well, I hope I've lived a good enough life to get to heaven. Well, newsflash, you haven't. None of us have. We can't. We're not capable of that. And because we aren't, we realize that maybe we want to give up. Maybe we start having these feelings of, I can never be good enough. And Paul even talks about some of these very things later in the letter. Jump ahead to Romans chapter 7 about, I'm not going to read these per se, but I think it's chapter 7, verse 7-ish. He talks about, I do those things that I don't want to do, right? You remember all that discussion, right? Do the things I don't want to do and so forth. And he, I don't know, somewhere around in the 20s, he says, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me, right? He had some of these very same challenges himself. And thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord, he says. We ought to look at our struggles and realize that, praise God, I'm not good enough, but he's going to do for me what I can't do for myself. And that's the kind of good news. We talk about Paul being obligated, right? Verses 14 and 15, and him wanting to go teach the gospel, being eager to go teach the gospel. That's the kind of good news we ought to feel obligated to teach. We ought to be eager to go deliver. Now, that that kind of concludes the introductory good news part of Romans, because we're going to get into some things over the next chapter and a half which are kind of the bad news. But you have to go through the bad news and understand it to appreciate the good news. And so stick with me for a little bit, because we're going to be in that bad news part a little bit. And stick with me for this too, because I'm going to show you some Greek. But this was really helpful for me in my understanding of some things that are going on here. So when we read Romans in our English Bibles, we have some challenges that are just the result of the fact that English wasn't the language in which they were written. So we have challenges like words that appear the same to us but are actually used in a different sense in the original language. And the case here, more so, words that appear completely different to us but are actually highly related in the language, in the root language in which they're written in the Greek. And so righteous and righteousness, they look fairly similar in the English language. Patrick was talking about verbs and nouns, and sorry for any of you who don't like, all that kind of stuff, but we're getting into it tonight. You got this next word here, justify. Does that look anything like righteous or righteousness? In the original language is very much related. It's part of the same root word. And then you've got righteous requirement of God's law. So we're going to go through these individually. So what we've got is the Greek words, their meaning, the part of speech they're used for. An example in the book of Romans. Oh, actually, is this the, sorry, Well, I think this may not be the latest slide deck. I had put like a reference here. If you want these, I will get it to you. Nonetheless, there's an example for each one of these that I put in an updated table. So that first word there, dikaios, and if I mispronounce, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce Greek. I just pulled this stuff out of the software, okay? I can do that part. But what is that word? It means one who is perfect and sinless in God's sight. So in chapter 3 and verse 10, Paul uses this word. He says, there is none righteous, no, not one. That's the word he's using right there. There is none who is perfect and sinless in the eyes of God. And developing on the same idea, Romans 3:23 explains why we're not perfect, where it says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That have sinned, that's past tense. Something that happened in the past results in the present tense falling short of the glory of God. Because you have sinned, you fall short. So let's say, this is definitely not the case in any way, but let's say I lived a perfect life with the exception of I hit some hard times financially and I knocked over the bank and I stole $100,000. Can I be judged? Can I be deemed innocent? Am I really innocent in that case? I'm guilty. That's the only thing I ever did in my life, but that's the one thing that I did, and one time, one failure is enough to be deemed guilty. Now, thankfully, I can be forgiven of that, but I'm not truly innocent, and no one is going to go through an entire life and have one sin in their lifetime. The point is that we can't be perfect. We cannot be dikaios. We cannot be perfect and sinless in God's sight of ourselves. The second word on this list is that same word. Notice, by the way, the first 6 letters are all the same. When I talk about these being essentially, people who would have spoken Greek, recognizing these words to be related, the first 6 letters are all the same. That's why they would recognize them as being very related. So this next word is righteousness, and it's a noun. So that first one we looked at, it's an adjective. It describes it describes one who is perfect and sinless in God's sight. But this is the noun to describe righteousness, all right? And it's one who is, the quality that one who is perfect and without sin that they possess. None of us have this quality on our own. And in chapter 1 and verse 17, which I'm just going to flip back to, I'm trying to flip back to the prior slide, and there we go. Okay, chapter 1 and verse 17, right here where it says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. So the righteousness of God, the quality of God being perfect and without sin, that's what that's talking about. That's that word, okay? The gospel reveals God's righteousness, the fact that He is perfect and without sin. And for me, I don't have that quality. I need that quality. I can't obtain it on my own. Third word on our list right here is, ends in the double O's. I have no idea how to pronounce that. I'm not going to try. But it's a verb. It's the action, and it's justify or made righteous is what it means. So to cause one to be made righteous in God's sight. So I can't cause myself to be righteous in God's sight. As we talked about in chapter 3, verse 10, there's none righteous, no, not one. This idea of if I can be good enough, maybe I can go to heaven. It doesn't work that way. Because that noun above, right, that's perfection. And even if I've only had one sin in my whole lifetime, I've blown that. Only God can make righteous. We looked in Romans chapter 4 just a moment ago, but let's back up to verse 2, back in Romans chapter 4, if you want to turn back over there real quick. This is where this word is used, Romans 4 and verse 2. For if Abraham was justified, that's the word, if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. Okay, so Abraham cannot cause himself to be made righteous in God's sight. He can't do that, okay? Only God can make one righteous. So what that verse is saying, if Abraham's works made him righteous, what would he do? He would tell God, well, look at all these things I've done. Look at me. I'm big righteous Abraham, because all this stuff I've done, right? And that's not the idea at all, because only God can make someone righteous in His sight. And then finally, this word that ends in O-M-A, Oma. I'm going to leave the rest of that alone. But that's the sum total of the law's requirements. So a good way to think of that is like, making 100 on the test. And if you make a 99 on the test, it's just like making a 32 on the test. It's a binary thing. You either get it all or you get nothing. It's one or the other. You can't, make a 95 and still have an A, okay? So it's the righteous requirement of the law. It's the sum total of all those things. This is used in chapter 1 and verse 32, if you want to know a reference here, where it says, though they know God's righteous decree, that's what this is talking about, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. It's saying that the people are aware of the sum total of the law, or the kind of what the outcome of that, what the punishment is for sin, yet they persist in sin anyway. But we need to carry away from this that you can't make a 95 and still be on the dean's list of righteousness. Let's say it's 100 or nothing, and we can't work our way into heaven. There's not enough works that we can do to merit our own salvation. So why do I go through all these? Well, understanding all these things is key, particularly the relationship between justification and being made righteousness. Understanding that linkage is key to understanding the book of Romans. It's not that you got to go understand every single word and how he uses it and that kind of thing, but where I've had a few challenges and been able to look this up, it's been very helpful to me. But the main point to remember is that word justify, wherever you see it in the book of Romans, if you just kind of replace that in your head with made righteous, that's really what it means. And that word it has everything to do, it's very related with righteousness in general. We want to, kind of expanding on this bottom one right here, and the 99s versus the 32s. If somebody told me what I was doing wrong, I might have a tendency to want to say, well, at least I'm not as bad as that guy over there. That guy, he's low down. He's good for nothing. I'm better. I'm comparing myself to somebody else. I'm thinking I'm one of the 99 students, right? And that guy over there is a 32 student, right? And I want to make a comparison that way. And that's really not how it works, because the righteous requirement of God's law, the sum total of law's requirements, right? We need to be deemed righteous to be in front of Him. He doesn't tolerate sin in His presence. So we need to be deemed righteous, and He's the only one who makes that possible. So we've got to follow His terms about that. Think about who Paul is writing to in this letter. Let's go back up to that. The Roman church is composed of two primary groups of people. Who are they? Jews and Gentiles, right? To just break it down that way, or maybe Jews and Greeks, however you want to break that down. The Jews are on one hand and saying, at least I'm not the Gentiles, and the Gentiles are saying, at least I'm not the Jews, right? And that's what's going on here. Paul's trying to get them to see, the 99 versus 32, the comparisons against each other are not where your mind ought to be. You ought to be thinking about that master that gives you everything, the master that owes you nothing but gives you everything. And so that's one of the big messages from the book of Romans. I haven't really gotten far yet, but anyway, it seemed worth going over. All right, let's go ahead in the text to verses 18 to 23. So Paul often writes in comparison and contrast kind of language. So we saw in verses 16 and 17 that the righteousness of God is revealed through his gospel, which is the power to salvation. Well, here we see the unrighteousness, right? The comparison, the contrast, the unrighteousness of man being revealed through man's actions, and that brings about God's wrath. And, they're suppressing the truth. If you look at verses 16 and forward, which I realize I don't have 16 on the screen there, but you can follow this type of logic that was fairly common in Paul's day, where you can almost see the questions he's perceiving in his mind as he writes this letter, where he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel in verse 16. Well, you can imagine somebody saying, why is that, Paul? He says, because it's the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes. Well, how is it God's power to salvation? Because in it, verse 17, the righteousness of God is revealed. Well, why is that necessary, Paul? Well, verse 18, because God's wrath is poured out against the unrighteousness of men. Well, what have they done, Paul? They've suppressed the truth, verse 18. And then how have they done that, Paul? And the verses 19 and 20 really tell us about that. And it's all about them not acknowledging God based on the evidences that he's given them that they can easily sense. Their eyesight. Think about that as we read verses 19 and 20 here together. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So the high-level story is that God gives anyone and everyone enough evidence in nature to know that he's there and that he's God. You'll see this word, know. Where does it appear here? I know it's in here somewhere. Verse 19, thank you very much. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. And I think it appears even more often in here, but I'm not going to slow us down. But whenever you see that word know in chapter 1, it's pretty fascinating. That's an experiential type of know. So it contrasts with a book learning kind of know. So there's multiple words that are actually translated know in chapter 1, but they are all about what I can experience around me. None of them are about what I can go learn in a book. They're all about what I can experience just by being out and around and opening my eyes and going through my daily walk of life and experience. And so God gave us this ability to experience things and know and perceive that he is there in everything he's created around us. And if we choose to ignore those evidences and not seek him out, that's on us, regardless of our background. Verse 21 says that they knew God. So there it is. I did call it out in my notes here. Although they knew God, that's in there again, right? So they had enough evidence to perceive that he was there, but for whatever reason, they chose to ignore that evidence and not acknowledge him. And then that's equated to suppressing the truth, verse 18. It's been said that creation is the visible disclosure of the invisible God. I love that quote. I should have looked up who said it. But anyway, the idea is that artists reveal themselves in their work. And Psalm 19:1 says pretty much the same thing about God, where it says the heavens declare, what is it? Yeah, the majesty of God, the glory of God, whatever your translation is. The heavens declare the glory of God. He reveals himself in what it is that, he's created in the heavens, but even here on our earth, what we can look around and see and observe. You don't have to be a religious person per se to be able to just go outside and see some of the evidences and observe some of the things that are around you and be able to perceive that there's an intelligent designer to some of these, to many of these things. And note that what God's wrath is, that it is poured out here in verse 18. People like to talk about the positive aspects of God. People in the broader Christian community would love, they'll talk about God's love all day long. And hey, even the righteousness of God in verse 17 that's revealed in the gospel, well, that's a good quality. We'll talk about that too. When you start talking about his wrath, which isn't necessarily, let's say, a characteristic per se, but it's kind of an output. But nonetheless, when you start talking about that kind of thing, yeah, people want to kind of back away from that if you think about those from the broad sense of the word Christian, and not necessarily go there so much. But that's one thing that Romans tells us right here that is poured out, and it's good for us to know, again, if we want to serve that good master and do everything we can for him, we would want to know what his wrath is poured out against and avoid those kinds of things. Now, his wrath isn't like human wrath. Human wrath is emotional, it's reactive, it's that kind of thing, but it's squarely pointed against ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Ungodliness, things that are against God, things that go against his nature. And the unrighteousness of man, things that man does that are wrong, just injustice, spreading lies, wrongdoing in general, that kind of thing. And ultimately suppressing the truth. Nobody anywhere can get rid of God and the fact that he exists. But some people choose to live as if he doesn't. And so by starting to, if they can't eliminate him, they just start living as if he's not there. And so they suppress the truth. So this is an intentional kind of suppression of truth. This isn't ignorance because, verse 19, the evidences are plain to them. God's shown it to them. He's given them enough evidence to show that he's there. But there, verse 20 says, without excuse. They know God, or verse 21 says, although they knew him, but they chose to suppress all that. Well, why does all that matter? Because God's our creator. When you create something, you got ownership in that thing. You get to choose how that thing is used, and you have a sense of ownership of that. Now, God made us, but instead of making us obedient, mindless robots, he gave us the ability to choose how we're going to live our lives. And we can choose to live our lives to our own glory, or we can choose to live our lives to his glory. And these individuals chose to forget about God, to act like he didn't exist at all, and just to live for themselves. Verse 20, I think it's verse 20, let's see. I'm looking for the word they. Verse 21, for although they knew God, who do you think that they is there, if you were trying to define they? Are there any evidences in Romans you can think about that help you infer who they is if you were trying to actually get more specific on the definition?
Mm-hmm. He's clearly talking about people who know that God exists, but refuse to honor him, refuse to give glory to him, refuse to accept him.
I think
so they is kind of a large group of people.
It is indeed a large group of people. I think we can get really specific, fairly specific with it, though. The reason I say that is, let's see here. If you go to chapter 2 and verse 1, notice that the pronouns used go from they to you. Okay? So this is the first thing I want you to notice. They go from they to you. And then go down to verse 17 in chapter 2. Indeed, you are called a Jew. I think you, as Jews, I think that's who he's going to be talking to in chapter 2 more so. I think he's kind of turning the tables a bit in chapter 2, especially based on the first few words in chapter 1. But the they here in chapter 1, I think, is the Gentiles. I think he's really talking about the broader Gentile world and saying, I've given them enough evidence to know that I exist, but they've not chosen, broadly speaking, they've not chosen to seek me out. So I think he's talking about a very broad group of people, and I think specifically he's talking about the Gentiles here. They didn't have, again, we think about that word know, And it's the experiential form. This is incredible stuff when you go back to the language and look at it. It's the experiential word of the versions of the word know, right? Or I should say the experiential types of that word. They're translated know in chapter 1. That's because the Gentiles get to experience those things in creation. They get to go outside and see the works that God has made. That's the bell for if you did not have the opportunity to partake communion, if you'll make your way down the hall to room 105, you'll be served there. But in chapter 2, it turns to the book learning form of the word know. Every time it's used, because the Jews had the Old Testament. They had the book. So they would know from it, but it would be book knowledge. They would know it from the book. Fascinating to see those things. Let's see here. Let's continue on. With what God has provided in nature around us, there's enough evidence to know Him just as these individuals did, but it's what we do once we know He's there that matters. And verse 21 tells us they didn't honor Him. They didn't allow Him to be the Lord of their lives. It also says they didn't give thanks. If we don't honor Him or give thanks to Him, what ends up happening, we end up starting this downward spiral of depravity that begins in verse 21. Where it talks about we're futile in our own thinking and our hearts are darkened. Verse 22, we'll think we're wise. We'll think maybe we've gained some knowledge that these simple-minded Christians don't have. But we're, I love the, claiming to be wise, they became fools. To me, that's like they don't know what they don't know. That's what that's saying. They're ignorant of just how broad their blind spots are. Namely, they don't even know who the God of the universe is, right? But they're going down this downward spiral of depravity. We'll be so blinded that by that so-called knowledge that we're going to be the foolish ones, verse 22. Instead of giving glory to God, verse 23, who did they give glory to? Images, yeah. So some image representing a mortal thing. Who made the images? Man, yeah. So what they're doing is creating an image. Man's creating an image with his own hands based on something that he can fathom intellectually, that he can call to mind. Well, guess what? God's not limited by the simple things that I can call to my mind. He's not limited to the things that, some of the greatest designers of all time could call to their mind, the Michelangelos of the world. He's not limited to that stuff. And anything that we can conceive as human beings takes the limitations that we have and puts them on God, right? We're trying to bring Him down to our level. That's the problem. That's one of the huge problems with that, trying to bring God down from His infinite, immortal form to something that we can perceive. And you might say, well, I don't have to worry about that. I don't have any idols. Well, could be an image that we exalt over God, but it could be a hobby, could be a job, could be sports, could be you name it. It could be anything that we put in first place in our lives and allow to take precedence over God. That takes away from the glory that He deserves. Also, I want you to realize that they exchange. There's 3 exchanges in Romans 1, and this is the first of them. So exchanging His glory. There's 2 more exchanges coming up. So let's see if we can get through the end of the chapter this evening. Verse 24 says, God gave them up. He let them go the way that they wanted to go to find the outcome of that path. And why is that? Verse 25, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped idols rather than Him. That's that second exchange in Romans 1. How'd they do that? They failed to acknowledge the truth that He exists, and they worship something that they created instead of worshiping the Creator. And what does He give them up to? Verses 26, starting with verse 26, dishonorable passions. And that's defined as lesbian and male homosexual activity. That may not be a politically correct message today, But the Bible doesn't need society's approval to be right. That is what it is. What society approves changes over time. God's word does not. We ought to love everybody now. Homosexuals are included in that. But that sin is no different than any other. If somebody just chooses to persist in it, God doesn't celebrate people persisting in sin, regardless of what the sin is. I know that society would say that we need to celebrate with those individuals particularly. But if you jump ahead to verse 32, it says, those who give approval to those who practice such things are called out worthy of a very severe punishment. But spoiler alert, we're all worthy of that very severe punishment. Every one of us is, and he's going to get to that. But what we're talking about here is different in that these people are trying to get people to continue. They are pushing for people to continue in their ungodly behavior. They're choosing to do that, knowing that it's wrong, and encouraging others to do the same. And when people don't acknowledge God, what does that lead to? Verse 28. It says, essentially, if you don't use the mental faculties he's given you, you've got a debased mind, or less mental faculties to work with. Just being able to perceive that he is God, that he is there from what you see around you. That debased word, some of the other ways that word is translated in the New Testament include unqualified, unfit, and worthless. When I think about the culture around us today, I don't know if I would use those exact words, but some aspects of it make me think of things that probably are in line with some of those words. I think we're seeing God's wrath poured out, right? And again, when he gives them up, he's letting them go to the ends of what those things are. And that really is unqualified, unfit, worthless, right? That's going to those ends. We've got a lot of lists that come up next that are, not easy to categorize, but you've got verse 29, just some general sins: unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. Sins that describe human relationship problems. You've got envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. Sins that are about tearing other people down. So gossips and slanderers in verses 29 and 30. Then you've got extreme forms of pride where you elevate yourself above God in verse 30. So haters of God, insolent, haughty, and boastful. And also verse 30, you've got rebellious people, those who look to cause trouble in everything. People who, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, it says. And then verse 31, people who are lacking something. Foolish people, lacking wisdom. Faithless people, lacking faith, obviously. Heartless people, lacking compassion. And the ruthless, lacking mercy. They know God's righteous decree, the decree that says those that practice such things deserve death, but they continue in them. Verse 32, they encourage others in those things as well. As we're getting close to wrapping up, I want to call us back to verse 18, where it talks about these are the outpouring. All these things that we've seen in this downward spiral of depravity are the outpouring of what? In verse 18.
Measured justice.
Measured justice, but what specifically is a 5-letter word? Wrath. They're outpouring of God's wrath, right? When human beings don't recognize God for what he's done, he gives them up. And that's really where this, that's an outpouring of his wrath. He lets them go down the path that they choose to go down. And if we think sometimes it may be, well, he's just let our world go to pot. Well, his wrath is outpoured by sometimes just letting people go down, achieve the ends of the decisions that they've made by kind of wallowing in the mire that society's created for itself. We should recognize these kind of behaviors around us, but know that really they're kind of symptomatic of often a broader problem of people just not recognizing God for who he is. So I guess that sounds wonderful. I told you we're going to be in the bad news part of Romans. We are. We're knee deep in it here, and we're going to be in it till about midway through chapter 3, if not a little further than that. but it gets better, I promise you. So I appreciate you, and hope you'll stick around for that, because good news is coming, promise. Any questions or comments? We probably got 30 seconds maybe, if that. Yes, sir.
God didn't let our world go to pot, we did.
Agreed. Agreed. Right? Yeah, he gave them up. That's clear. But that was because of the choices we made.
There's no
Yep.
more shame in anything because we refuse to hold people accountable for their sins and their bad actions.
Yeah, he gave them up. Yep. Yep. Good deal.
Important thought. In a religious world, you have people buying off and approving homosexual marriage, various iterations or examples of homosexuality, but when it occurs in the Lord's church, giving approval to that is a sin. And I might go so far as to say, because the Word says it, it's a condemning sin.
Yeah.
Worthy of discipline in the body of Christ.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep. Yep. Any sin that someone persists in, that's a visible one, right? So I think it gets, but sin that people persist in, that takes us away from being, we are choosing not to be made righteous.
Well, in this example, it's one who just gives approval to it.
Yeah.
I didn't do it, I just approve of it. As Jimmy Carter once said, what do you think about homosexual marriages? What did Jesus say? Carter said, I think you'd be okay with it.
Good, but that's a choice to approve it the same way. Good deal. Thank y'all so much. Appreciate you.